Hi, my name's Caroline Beckett and I'm Vicar of Brightlingsea, but I'm currently not in Brightlingsea. I'm in Southampton visiting parents and I'm lurking in their upstairs spare room.
My name's Andy Griffiths. I'm an adult educator working for the Diocese of Chelmsford, and I was late on this call because, to be honest, we had our briefing day for new curates yesterday, and I don't know how they feel, but it wiped me out, and getting going to record at 9 o'clock wasn't easy for me.
Hi, my name's Gemma Fraser. I'm the priest in charge at St John's Church at Molsham Street in Chelmsford and St Luke's over in Molsham Lodge. I'm also taking a breath after a busy day yesterday. It was our first day back in the church building and combining that with online worship.
And
together
we are at a distance,
rethinking
Christian
leadership. Gemma, it's so good to have you with us. And as you say, you're vicar of 2 churches in Chelmsford, but you've also had a role with mobilising people during the pandemic. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, of course. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So we realised here in Molsham pretty soon after lockdown that there were some people around us that were in quite serious trouble, especially those who didn't have family and friends around them to provide just everyday stuff that all of a sudden we couldn't take for granted. That's things like food, that's picking up shopping, that's picking up prescriptions. We all know how hard it was to get an online shopping delivery in those early days. And some people didn't even have the money to pay for them at that time as well. And we knew that there was going to be a wider system mobilised. We knew that Essex County Council and Chelmsford County Council were setting something up. But when you're trying to set something up at that scale, which just is thousands of people that it's helping, it takes a while to get that up and running safely. We knew that we had the opportunity to impact a bit more locally and that we could get it up and running quickly because we weren't working with quite so many people. So we took a local focus on the 2 parishes of Molsham and Molsham Lodge, and we looked at what we could do. And first of all, we looked at partnerships. So we were already working in partnership with some local organisations. So we were able to join up with them. So we had the 2 churches, St John's and St Luke's, working with Child Kiln Evangelical Church that's on Molsham Lodge, and also an organisation called Molsham Lodge Community Trust. And Molsham Lodge Community Trust are all about empowering the community of Molsham Lodge to improve life for the residents on that estate. And what we did is we set up something called the Molsham Support Project. Now, the Molsham Support Project worked at 3 levels. At the most basic level, we were encouraging people to reach out to friends and family. We were all so proud of how the community mobilised in those early days and people were stepping up to help people. So we firstly encouraged people to reach out for those around them for help and support. And then there was the second level. So there was a whole group of people, those who were extremely clinically vulnerable, that needed really high level services. And that just wasn't something that we were equipped or skilled to be able to do. So we worked as a signposting body for those into the NHS services, into social care if they needed a package. And then thirdly, there was everybody else. And that's the level that we set up the Molsham Support Project for. So it's the people that were at home but not necessarily shielding, those that were vulnerable, those that were worried about family members accessing the things that they need. So we recruited some volunteers, absolutely blown away by the number of volunteers. We had about 40 people come forward in those early few weeks. And we recruited some coordinators who stepped up, and we ran an on-call service for people if they needed shopping, if they needed prescriptions collected, if they needed someone just checking on, then we were able to match them up with a volunteer. We also ran a hardship fund. Unfortunately, we did encounter more and more people who weren't able to afford things, so we were able to make small grants from the hardship fund, and we became a food bank partner as well, so we were able to refer into the food bank for those that needed that support. Now, that changed as the weeks went on. When Essex Welfare Service came into being, we morphed into a bit of a satellite of that. We continued to take on local jobs for people, but we also took on jobs that were referred down to us by the more Essex-wide service. We did some of the NHS welfare checks. If people were shielding and not answering the phone, then we were able to send a volunteer around just to check that they were still doing okay and whether there was anything else that they needed. Yeah, we're still running. We're still going at the moment, but again, it's morphing into something else entirely now. The numbers have dropped, but we're still helping a number of people. And this is something that we're committed to for long term. It's been such an amazing project for us that we're working out what does it mean to just incorporate into the mission of the church and to provide that long-term support to people that might need it, while still building partnerships and not disempowering communities to cast.
And early in lockdown, you wrote a letter, and I liked it so much that I asked you if you'd mind reading it to us now.
Yeah, of course. Hold on, bear with me 2 seconds. Let's find it. So this is a letter. It went out to both the church families and then out in the parish magazine as well. This was in April this year that I wrote this. So it started with, "Hi everyone, I hope you're doing okay and staying well. I miss you all. I miss being together as a community. I miss being able to be out and about in our community, as I'm sure you all do. My life is currently taken up with producing worship, pastoral care, funeral ministry, coordinating the Motion Support Project, homeschooling children, and trying to keep a house with 6 people and several animals tidy. There isn't much peace here, but I know that some are struggling with isolation, so I'm valuing the time that I have with Julian and the girls. I've been reflecting on the balance between lament and hope in the past few weeks. The reality is that this is all pretty awful. People are sick and people are dying. I am now dealing with 8 funerals. Families haven't been able to be with loved ones while they were dying or to see them afterwards. They're having to cope with shortened funeral services with only immediate family members allowed to attend. I've had conversations with people for whom the isolation is causing deep distress and loneliness, and people have lost jobs and businesses. The Christian faith isn't fluffy. It doesn't ask us to pretend that everything is okay when it clearly isn't. Take a look at the Psalms. They're full of people crying out why to God. And the authors don't get an easy answer to that question, and neither do we. It's deeply biblical to express our sorrow, our frustration, and our sheer inability to understand. However, neither are we to despair. There is much to give us hope at the moment. I was deeply concerned for our culture before all of this. It felt like we were heading into a nationalistic, protectionist, me first situation. But now the people who a few months ago were ignored and devalued are now the people we can't live without. Our nation has recognised the value of rubbish collection, supermarket workers, care staff, and so many others. We're seeing neighbours connecting, the church mobilising to offer care and support, and so many going above and beyond to serve others. I see a much kinder narrative emerging, and that gives me real hope. Hope is at the centre of our faith. After all, we worship a God who suffered, died, and spent 3 days in a tomb. His disciples feared that all were lost, and how wrong they were. Psalm 46, verse 1-2 says, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the sea." I am praying for you all. I have everyone's names on a board in my office to remind me to pray for you each day. I'm praying for each of you, whether you are lamenting or riding the wave of hope, or perhaps a little bit of both. I pray that in the midst of this, you will feel Jesus with you as an ever-present help in trouble, that he may take away any fear, and that you may trust in the hope we have been given, and in turn be able to offer that hope to others. Every blessing, Gemma.
That's beautiful. And of course, what I naturally immediately want to ask is, do you still feel like that now? Have things changed since you wrote it? But rather than put all of our material into this episode, Gem, would you be willing to come back next time we do a recording for our last episode, which will be episode 20, and tell us all that stuff then?
I'd absolutely love to. I'm looking forward to hearing what the two of you got to say about what it means to be semi-emerging from all of this as well.
So Gemma, we've been looking at the process of community organising, and we've reached the final stage, which could be called enabling everyone to take their place. And that's partly about negotiation and leadership structures, but it's also about inviting people to take their place as children of God. In other words, this is the other half of evangelism. We spoke about evangelism as telling stories and helping people link their stories with God's stories back in episode 12.
I think as Christians, we have to keep the two together, don't we? I guess the invitation only really makes sense to us, those who are asking the questions, though. You know, people who have reason to hope for the world as it should be, and those who are asking the questions of how that might come about. We had our first service back in church yesterday, and the lecture was Romans 8:12-25. So I was preaching on what it means to hope for something we don't see. And that's what the church is all about for me. It's provoking questions about hope. It's like Peter says, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within you. The problem is, most of the times, these aren't questions that people are asking because the church isn't provoking the questions.
I think that's exactly it. And that's what a young Singaporean Christian called Raymond Fung was wrestling with in 1970, when he went to a meeting addressed by a Jewish agnostic called Saul Alinsky.
Saul Alinsky, the founder of community organizing.
Yes, Caroline, that's Saul Alinsky, who said, well, I don't know. We don't know exactly what he said. We only know that Raymond Fung liked what he said. But I guess what Saul Alinsky said was, you know, there's a different way to bring about change. There's the iron rule, and there's broad-based leadership, and there's a process of organizing and listening and planning and action and enabling everyone to have a seat at the table. And Raymond Fung made it his life's work to develop a community organizing approach to evangelism.
And he got a long way with it. He became Secretary for Evangelism at the World Council of Churches. Together with George Carey, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, he launched what was called the Decade of Evangelism in the 1990s.
I always thought the Decade of Evangelism was all about Billy Graham and nurture groups.
Well, yes, and by the end of the 1990s, under the influence of Steve Croft, Stephen Cotterill, Nicky Gumbel and others, nurture groups such as Alpha and Emmaus had become central. But at the beginning of the decade, the World Council of Churches strategy was a community organising tool by Raymond Fung called the Isaiah Vision. And it's still worth considering and following. The Isaiah Vision has 3 stages. 1, the local congregation espouses a vision for the world as it should be. We talk about that quite a lot in community organising. Such as the one derived from Isaiah 65:20-23. That children do not die, that older people live in dignity, that there's appropriate housing for all, that those who plant vineyards eat their fruit, i.e. that working people get a fair return for their labour. And it joins in partnership with other institutions to build power and people to achieve this vision.
So the first stage is all about a vision for the world as it should be. The second stage is that the church should work with partners to transform society and invite all people to worship. So it's like you're working shoulder to shoulder with all sorts of other partners, building an alliance to do some similar things. And you say to the people alongside you, by the way, you'd be really welcome to join us in worship. And of course, you have to ensure that the worship that you offer is attractive and accessible to all.
Absolutely. And then as trust and friendship develops, there will be occasions when others ask the reason for the hope that's in us. And Christians invite them not only to worship with us, but also to discipleship, that is, to come under God's rule. And the quote is, make it attractive, make good men, we would say good people these days, wish it were true, and then show them that it is. Make it attractive, make them wish it were true, and then show them that it is.
I love it. I'm absolutely with you in theory in this, but potentially a little bit idealized.
Yeah, it might be actually, and maybe that's the reason that nurture groups, Alpha and Emmaus and groups like that, had to be added to the strategy before the decade of evangelism had finished. In a review at the time, Paul Beasley Murray said, and I'm quoting Beasley Murray, Fung's evangelistic strategy is limited to people of goodwill, to those who are already concerned for society and its needs. The fact is that the great mass of society is happily pursuing its own self-interests.
Well, it may be true that most of society is made up of people not of goodwill, but I think that's a pretty bleak way to see people. And I think that most people are really a mixture. You know, we're a mix of selfishness and self-interest, which is not the same as selfishness, but is about the things that get us going and get us passionate, and some altruism. And even if people's circle of altruism is very small and limited only to their family or to their very close friends, we are all still capable of altruism. And just look at how galvanized ordinary people become if a member of their family dies of cancer or gets some condition, and suddenly they're out there raising money for that, or raising awareness for that, or talking about it. It doesn't really take very much when an issue touches their life for a person to actually get up and get involved and get passionate. But now, through the Centre of Theology and Community, there is in fact evidence as well that community organising may be linked with numerical growth in evangelical churches more strongly than traditional evangelical outreach. And it's our testimony that sometimes the way that God starts to open a heart is precisely by giving them a new desire for justice and for the world as it should be.
Exactly. So look, for example, at Acts 10:4. So an angel comes to a Roman soldier called Cornelius, and the angel says, I quote, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God, and therefore, says God, says the angel, God is sending Peter to come and tell you some good news." Now, it cannot possibly be that Cornelius's attitude to the poor have earned him salvation, as if God's saying, "Oh, who shall I save? I know, I'll save the people who give most to the poor." That's not how God works. But Cornelius's concern for the poor is a symptom that his heart is open, and it implies God's doing something in Cornelius. And the angel diagnoses openness to the gospel as the root cause of his concern for the poor.
And I've seen that principle work in action many times. There is a saying that we use in our family quite often: it's easier to steer a moving vessel. If somebody is not firmly planted, if they're questioning or they're looking for something beyond what they have, then actually it's a lot easier to work with somebody like that than with somebody who's convinced they've got everything they need and they've got it all sorted. But also, we often find that the biggest barrier to people coming to faith isn't that faith isn't attractive. In fact, the opposite is the case. Faith and the world that is painted in the Gospels and Scripture is so attractive that people believe it can't possibly be true. And people are so deeply suspicious of being offered false hope, of somebody making a fool of them, of, snake oil salesmen and the peddlers of hope that turn out to be disappointing. And so actually often what I wrestle with in conversations with people is not that they don't want to believe, it's that they long to believe, but they really desperately fear being taken in. And so often it's easier to say, well, come along the justice journey with us. Whether you believe or not, you can't argue that the world will be a better place at the end of this piece of work. So if you don't believe what we believe, then do what we do. And it's the belonging, believing, behaving, whatever order you put those three things in, people can enter at each of those points. People can come to believe because something's happened in their life and then learn the belonging and the behavior. Or people can be made welcome, as we were talking earlier about accessible worship, so that even if the worship isn't theirs at the start, the welcome is theirs. And they feel so welcome that over time, they begin to adopt the behaviours of those around them because they can see that they're life-giving, and then the believing comes in. So there are many, many ways of being drawn in. And I think particularly of a conversation that I had with a couple of teenagers. I have lots and lots of incidental conversations, but I had a conversation with a couple of teenagers while I was at Greenbelt Festival. And they were saying that they had come into the church because they had come to realise that all of the things that they had thought that their generation had invented, or at the very least promoted, you know, things like taking care of the environment, looking after each other, every life having a value, and all of these things that they were deeply passionate about, you know, being anti-racist and all the rest of it. And they were discovering that actually these were ideas that the church had been talking about for years. And one of them said, well, you've got to respect that you lot have been going on about this for years and years. And, you know, that there was an integrity to what the church was speaking about, and what the church was putting into action. And flawed though it was, and occasionally cheesy though it was, they found the sincerity deeply attractive. And so that's what drew them to the church, not the adults' attempts to be trendy, which they found utterly cringeworthy and diabolical, but actually the sincerity of people working for the kind of world that they wanted to be living in and wanted to see. And I think there is immense power in being people of hope who live as people of hope. And the other conversation that comes to mind is I've got an atheist friend. Well, he started off self-designating as atheist, although he occasionally self-designates as agnostic now, and he says that's my fault, although I don't think it's my fault entirely. But he is one of those who would very, very much, I mean, in fact, I've got a number of friends who would put themselves in the atheist or agnostic camp, but say they really would like to believe. And he gets incredibly moved being in the church building and just watching the church family do what they do. And extend its welcome to him. And there have been a few things that he's worked on with his local church and got involved with his local church. And he's drawn more and more to do things with the church because it is a different quality of being, a different way of being to the way of being that he finds in other places. And you know, that's not the several step plan to salvation. You know, it doesn't fit the box. But we are all on a journey with God, and God, I think, invites us in different ways, different places, different times, different stages, and we're happy to be a staging post on the journeys of various people.
How about you, Jim?
Yeah, we've certainly found that too. And I've got a kind of corporate example, if that's right. So St John's and St Luke's have started to look at being eco-church. And you know what? That started from a really secular concern to start with. You know, we were hearing the things around us. It didn't come from the church. It came from the wider community, at these concerns. And it started off about conversations about shampoo bars and, you know, reusable toothbrushes and things, and the reduction of single-use plastic. But as we've gone on that journey, and we've gone on that journey as a whole church, and with people on the fringe and in the community as well, as we've dug down into the theology, as we've started to ask, well, what does God say? What does the Bible say about our concern for our world? What does it mean to be in right relationship with God, with creation, and with each other? We found that it's really deepened our faith, and it's united us all together behind a common cause. Yeah, we're all going on that journey together. It's been amazing.
And I've already told the stories of S and R in earlier podcasts, just their initials. And both of them were attracted to church life precisely by a provocative church acting in the community. R, as I was saying, was a local councillor who initially made contact with church because he was aware he didn't have relationships with the poorest in the parish, and the church did. And he came to commit himself to Jesus in the family of the church. S had ceased to be part of another church when it told her she shouldn't be involved in youth work outside the church unless it resulted in increased church attendance. And then when she encountered a church which positively valued community engagement that rekindled her commitment to church, but to Jesus. And the story of B, again, just to use an initial, is similar. Soon after the death of his father, B moved to a city to begin community organizing, and soon found that although he wasn't himself a person of faith, his greatest allies were church pastors, and they worked alongside him and made a difference in their community and kept inviting him to worship with them. So, of course, he politely declined. In his own words, quote, "I would shrug and play the question off. But while I believed in the sincerity I heard in their voices, I remained a reluctant skeptic, wary of expedient conversion, aware of having too many quarrels with God to be easily won. And yet, without a vessel for my beliefs, without an unequivocal commitment to a particular community of faith, I would be consigned at some level always to remain apart, free in the way my mother was free, but ultimately alone, in the same way as she was ultimately alone." So finally, he chose an 8 o'clock in the morning service, and he slipped in the back, and he heard a sermon that would change his life. It was called "The Audacity of Hope," and it spoke of the slender hopes of Hannah, the mother of Samuel. By the end of the sermon, B was in tears and convinced that he wanted to join with this church and this people. But in his own terms, he was not yet a Christian. That was to come months later, when church attendance had become normal to him. And in his words, quoting again, "My coming home to God came after my coming home to a community. And it came about as a choice and not an epiphany. Kneeling beneath that cross, I felt God's Spirit beckoning me. I submitted myself to his will and dedicated myself to discovering his truth." These are real people. I still see R once a month. He and I are members of the same accountability group. S would have been ordained a priest in Chelmsford Cathedral a couple of weeks ago if it were not for coronavirus. And B, well, you've all guessed who B is. He became the 44th president of the United States.
Gemma, thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to having you with us again in our next one too. We've been at a distance, rethinking
Christian
leadership.